morning. My name is Ann Ayers, and I have the distinct honor and privilege of being the Dean of the Colorado Women's College here at the University of Denver, and even more so of being the co-lead on this incredible project, Community Plus Values, that we have mounted in an effort to really recognize that having a sense of belonging, knowing that the people you work with and the institution you work on behalf of care about you and want you to be able to be successful. And so we're doing what we can to support our community through this time. And I can just speak for myself personally and say that, well, the last several weeks, obviously the last 3 months have been very, very turbulent, but in particular since George Floyd's death and multiple other situations, it feels like the pressure has just gotten bigger and bigger and bigger. And so today, this morning, when I was able to log on and look at the faces of my colleagues that you'll be speaking with today, I have to say that it just gave me a moment of peace, a moment of hope, and a moment of pride about the fact that DU has these resources, that we have these people in our community who care so deeply about equity, who care so deeply about Black lives, and who care so deeply about one another. So with that, welcome to this morning's conversation. Thomas Walker, who is the Director for Inclusion and Equity Education, is going to lead us through this. We're going to be talking about racial justice and how we show up for one another. So I'm gonna sign off, and I'm going to sit back and I'm going to soak every word in. So thank you so much, Thomas. I'm gonna let you introduce the rest of your guests as you go along. Thanks.
Thanks, Dean Ayers. Welcome, everyone. We kind of dropped everybody who was waiting into the space with us. You haven't missed anything. That was Dean Ayers just giving a quick welcome, and so we've just gotten started. A few housekeeping notes. We have a slew of panelists. I'll introduce or have them introduce themselves in just a moment. You are able to access closed captioning through a button along the bottom of your Zoom screen. Just click on that, and that will be live captioned as we go. Reminding myself and our panelists to try to speak slowly so that the captioner can get all of our sharings. We have some introductory remarks and then a round robin of questions with our panelists, and we'll end with some resources to share at the end. We will go the full hour, and if you have, that will include some time for question and answers. If you have something you'd like the panel to discuss, we'll try to get to as many of those as possible, and you can share those with us by opening the chat window also along the bottom of your screen, dropping it in there, and we are watching that, and we'll again try to get to as many of those as possible. I'm going to begin with just some opening statements and then go with the flow. I'm on a split screen, so I'm looking away a little bit just to be able to read. But we again thank everyone for making some time to spend with us, and we hope that you will find it useful as both a connection and as an information in these anxious and angry days. To begin, in recent weeks, a number of critical social issues have dominated the news, the streets, and campus, each having significant racial injustice, focus, and impact. There's obviously the pandemic impacting all of us in our work, learning, play, worship, etc., both this school year and beyond. And that definitely has a differential impact by class, occupation, health, ability, education level, and more, all of which intersect with race and ethnicity, including xenophobia around nationality playing out through race. In addition, we more recently have police violence, immigration, and larger law enforcement industries in the news, again with patterns that disproportionately negatively impact communities of color. And just recently, again, just some discrete incidents directly connected to DU, like an admitted student social media post wearing blackface and using racial slurs. You may have seen on social media some resurfaced historical pictures of students in a residence hall at DU from some number of years ago engaged in what looks like a mock lynching. So all three of these and many other things, again, impacting communities of color, particularly Black and African-American communities. There's no claim that white people or other groups don't have problems or stresses in our lives, These issues we mentioned are in addition to and interwoven with the everyday and activities and pressures we all have. But these specific incidents and situations highlight, but did not create, long-standing patterns of inequity based in race, ethnicity, and skin color. And that racial injustice is the lens through which we are engaging impact and action today. We certainly acknowledge that there are other identities and systems, and that their intersectionality complicates both the impact and our opportunities for action. We also promise that this hour together will not cover all these issues, will not provide all answers, will not resolve all problems, but we do hope that our time together provides another DU opportunity for exposure to information, reflection on experience, sharing and learning, so that we all, individually, institutionally, and more collectively, can better challenge ourselves and support one another in efforts for racial justice, mindful and not regardless of our social identities like race and ethnicity. I'm honored today to be joined by several generous colleagues who've agreed to participate on rather short notice as we shape today's session toward current events. While they have extensive academic and professional experience with these issues, and that will inform their sharings, we've asked them here and focused our questions on personal experiences. As we quickly compiled the panel this week, we tried to consider a practical number of panelists for this format, the diversity of multiple identities on the panel. Given the differential impacts, we didn't want to burden people of color, particularly Black or African Americans, with educating others yet again, but we also didn't want to focus so exclusively on white people or white voices that we cut out people of color voices in this campus engagement of racial justice. So as all groups are wrapped up in these systems, just in different ways, we decided to ask the Inclusion and Equity Education and Office of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion staffs in expectation that we all may be some of the most experienced at engaging these issues professionally, and so best able to share our personal struggles and victories. For our time together, we'll have our panelists introduce themselves as they begin answering questions. We have several rounds of pre-prepared questions we'll go through. And again, we'll be watching chat to try to respond to questions from some of our participants. You can again enter those in the chat and end by sharing a few resources where you can continue reflection, learning, and action. And a last reminder, you can turn on the closed captioning by clicking on that button in your menu bar at the bottom. That said, I'm going to begin with our first question. I'll be responding as a panelist as well. And again, we'll just ask the panelists in this first response to give a brief introduction of yourself too. First question, the recent prejudice, racial injustice, violence, and resistance are recent and perhaps well broadcast, but not new experiences. What was your earliest or most impactful realization of race and racial injustice? And I'm going to open that up to whoever wants to jump in first.
You know, I'll jump in, Thomas. So rather than talk about my earliest experience, I would like to talk really about sort of the most consequential first experience, because I would say that up and through my sort of very young adulthood, I was kind of assuming that through hard work and doing things extra well or whatever, that I could kind of overcome, you know, racism. And it wasn't really until I found myself in the military stationed at Pearl Harbor that I had an experience that totally flipped that way of dealing with things. And it was an experience going through the front gate of the base at Pearl Harbor and encountering a Marine sergeant who cursed me out. I was wearing civilian clothes at the time. I actually was a naval officer, but I was going on base. Cursed me out for entering the base looking shabby, as he, you know, just went on and on and on about that. And he asked to see my ID. And when I showed him my ID, he promptly changed his stance and saluted me. Sir, I'm sorry what I've done to you, and so forth. And when I got to the ship, I asked my other officers who also had entered in civilian clothes what had happened with them, and they all had been admitted, you know, respectfully and everything. And that one experience just demonstrated to me that no matter how high my status or whatever, that I was always going to be seen unless I had some very visible sort of expressions of status. I was always going to be seen as Black, and I was going to be treated that way. And that totally changed my orientation and has influenced everything else I've done in my life.
Thanks, Art. And Dr. Jones is our Interim Vice Chancellor for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion here on campus, and a longtime faculty member and administrator. Thank you for that. Other panelists? I can, oh, go ahead, Kristin.
I'll jump in. I'm Kristin Deal. I'm the director of the Office of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion. I've shared this in multiple spaces before, so some of you may have heard this, but I think about my racial socialization in particular in a series of years, so between 1992 and 1995, which tells you a lot maybe about my current age, but between 4th grade and 8th grade. And I grew up in the outskirts of LA in a small white flight town that at that point was probably 95 to 97% white. And really what framed kind of my understanding of race in really unique ways is where the Black man sat in the courtroom. And that those years bucket the time between the Rodney King trial, beating and trial, the LA riots, and then the O.J. Simpson trial. And I remember very distinctly watching both play out over time from the kind of collective confines of this white flight town, and really hearing the conversations that were being had in my hometown around how we should think about kind of the Black-white binary, although I didn't have that language back then, and how we thought about whether or not we should collectively consider the Black man in the courtroom, so either Rodney King or O.J. Simpson, as fully human and fully worth our time and our energy. And it was really determined on whether or not we saw ourselves as good people, right? So Rodney King, it was very much, and I was in 4th grade at that time, that he was, though some may have considered him a victim, the conversation was really around whether or not he deserved the beating and then the resulting riots. And then O.J. Simpson, it was that he killed a white woman. And so of course we should disdain him. And so those were really unique moments in my upbringing. And they were bucketed at the end by a young woman in my 8th grade class who was brave enough to call out a group of us that were in gym class because the Oklahoma City bombing also happened right around that time. And we were in a gaggle kind of chit-chatting about what we thought. And she was just brave and walked up and called us all racist. And it was this really unique moment for me. One, I had never had that word directed straight at me. And my first gut was, I think she may be right. There's something behind it. And so really I think about kind of how I understand race and the beginnings of my kind of maybe re-understandings between those years. And so when we're in times like now and we're watching protests, that invokes kind of a lot of that reminder for me of where my first racial socializations began.
I can jump in quickly. So my name is Neda, and I'm the program manager for DU Dialogues. I also have been an undergrad student at DU, a graduate student at DU, and now staff member. In addition to that, I've also been a long-term community involved person. I don't know if you'd call that an activist or whatever else, but I've done that quite a bit in the Muslim community in Denver. So that's kind of some of my background. There's other things, but those are most relevant, I feel. The only thing I might add is that I've been working with youth since the earliest that I can remember, and that's all been around community organizing and community-based work. So I believe deeply and heavily in the ability for youth to change this world, and they always have. And college campuses have always been that space. So just felt like that's also very relevant to share. When I look at this question, I also have a second screen. So if I'm looking that way, I'm just kind of referencing some of the words. I'm a visual person. I think I was sitting with this question for a while because I think there's a lot of ways I could answer it, but I think the one that I landed on was when I was in 8th grade. And of course, there was other things before that. I grew up going abroad to see my family all the time. So there's lots of conversations of like racism, definitely Islamophobia, quite a bit in my life, instances way before, like the times I've been called terrorist, like that stuff has existed way before. But I think the one that I landed on was when I was in 8th grade, I actually, so I'm a baller, like my whole life I played basketball. And when I was in 8th grade, I was playing on this competitive team, and it happened to be that the team was up in Thornton. So I grew up in Denver, but it was up in Thornton. And for folks who might not know Thornton, it, at that time growing up, it was seen sometimes even just as worse as Aurora. And I think all of that is rooted in racism, just kind of say it up front. But it was a place where there were a lot of Latinos, and the Black community was out there as well. And there were some folks that were white kind of in that area, but it was predominantly the school that I played for, or the club that I played for. It wasn't a school, it was a club, was made up of Black and Latino women. And then there was me and maybe like 2 white girls. And so that was kind of the context that I had played on. And I had departed from my area over here in Golden, where in Lakewood's technically where I live, where I had played for an all white team. And I left this team to go play for that team because it was so much better. Just quite honestly, it was so much better. And I remember this duality in 8th grade of like, even so playing with my teammates, you know, like we're just shooting, I don't know if I can say this on camera, we're like shooting the shit. And so we're just like having a good time. And I'm like, you know, just hanging out with my girls. And then as soon as I get back to my school over here in Lakewood, I remember explicitly being told multiple times by faculty or by my teachers and by my peers, quote unquote, why are you speaking ghetto? What's going on? And I remember being like, what? And at first, like that might seem, oh, it's just like this interpersonal exchange you had. But I think the reason I chose this story was because it happened so many times throughout my basketball days. And I remember when those 2 teams, the one that I played for and the one my college, my competitive team, when they played each other, just how awful of an experience that was, because of the ways that the parents that were once on my side and cheering for me were now saying some pretty awful things. And also just like the players that I had played with that I thought were my friends were doing some pretty cheap shots against my competitive team. And so I think kind of taking a step back, like the reason I chose this story is because it isn't that one big time that you saw on the head news, right? It isn't that one big time that was highlighted in media, but what it did do was that it showed me at its core that as soon as you flip that script, as soon as you might have any kind of space or area that is now seen as counter to, right? Seen as counter, seen as a threat to, just how quickly people will switch on you and use those ideologies or use those stereotypes as a weapon. And in my situation, that is extremely lucky that it was just words, right? Like, because we've seen that be used in way different ways, and people actually lose their lives over ideologies, over stereotypes, over ways that we can take the ideology and use that as an institutional weapon. We've seen that. That is what's happening. And for me, like, that was my early exposure of being like, oh, I get why these ideas can be deadly. Oh, I get it. And not the full extent, because again, I'm not Black, period, right? This brown skin has a little bit, but I'm still also relatively like, I'm not going to dive into those pieces, but long story short, I don't get the full extent of that. It's just a small sliver. So I can't, yeah. I'm going to end there and kind of share it with other folks.
Thank you. I'll share quickly, and then maybe Tom, if you're ready. I grew up in Alabama as a obviously white guy, and in a family of nice white people. where based on the region's history and our family, race wasn't something we didn't talk about. I've run into people in my schooling and travels and stuff where the race just wasn't talked about, but we talked about it pretty openly. And while we were nice about it, there was the us and the them, and the people who needed to know their place, and we needed to know ours, and that was better in different ways. And so for me, I don't have a memory pre being aware of race. It's always been there with this polite sheen about, everything was fixed in the 60s. We watched in fourth grade Alabama history was what social studies was. And there was a week we talked about the civil rights movement, and it kind of ended with, and things were better. And then film was in color. And that happened in our town. But it was very much this thing of the past before there was color television and color film kind of stuff. And so for me, I've never not had it. It's just realizing that understanding, that engagement of race was not a good engagement of race, was not what most people had, good or bad, in that. And that my role wasn't just to be nice and to continue to celebrate that one day a year, to that victory 40 years ago, but an ongoing kind of piece to keep engaging in that work. I have had to realize many times through the years that explicit upbringing is actually rather rare for many white people in the United States specifically.
Thank you, Thomas. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, everybody in the audience. I thank you for sharing these stories. It reminds me, that I want to just also thank our DU students, particularly those that have been so having to deal with the anger and the fear and the uncertainty of this moment, and then those students in particular that have been such great leaders and advocates for really pushing the university to address these issues in some powerful ways. And of course, in the moment, right, acknowledging the thousands of people that have been directly impacted by COVID, the healthcare workers, the frontline workers, many of them that are in particular in the service, the restaurant, the food industries, the delivery industries, many of them people of color, right, that have been directly impacted by all of this. So, this certainly is my thinking in terms of thinking about my place, my identity, how I'm dealing with all of this. My name is Tom Romero. I wear many hats, I have many connections to the University of Denver. I'm an alumni, I'm a faculty member in the College of Law. I'm also a provost in the Office of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion. And some of you may have heard my story. I've said it before, but I'm the only son of Tomas and Susana Romero and Susana Villesquez now. My family's history is deeply connected to this place, this region. On my dad's side of the family, we go back 8 generations to what is now northern New Mexico and southern Colorado. My mother's side of the family is connected to the western slope of Colorado. My mother grew up in Olathe, Colorado. And if anybody knows where Olathe is at, that's a small town where we get in Colorado our sweet corn. And her parents, my grandparents, migrated to the United States in the early 1920s, fleeing the Mexican Revolution. So my story, their trajectory is both a familiar and an unfamiliar one. We like to say that on my dad's side of the family that we didn't cross the border, but the border crossed us. And it's certainly connected to a longer history and legacy of colonialism and conquest that my family was both impacted by and contributed and participated in. I was born and raised in the city and county of Denver, and I went to schools in the Denver Public Schools until I was about 10 years old. I was bused in the Denver Public Schools as part of the school desegregation decree that the United States Supreme Court confirmed, highlighting the long history and the deep institutional history of racial segregation in Denver's public schools. I was going to schools all of a sudden that were suddenly diverse, right? Diverse with white students, diverse with African-American students in particular, being bused in particular to Southwest Denver. And As a result of that experience, my parents actually then moved to sort of beyond the boundaries of Southwest Denver into Jefferson County. And I ended up going to middle school and high school at Chatfield Senior High School, which is sort of for your geography out in close proximity to Chatfield Reservoir. And that's going to have a little bit of a connection as I kind of finish my remarks. I ultimately ended up at the University of Denver. I went to 3 undergraduate institutions and ultimately settled at the University of Denver. I was an RA at JMAC in 1993, my junior year. So the image that was circulated on social media yesterday was particularly hit home really hard as I sort of think about being in that space and what that space has represented, right, over the course of the years. During my time at DU, I was attending a political rally for Bill Clinton at the time. And there were various student groups and student organizations that were asked to speak at that rally. And one of the organizations that was asked to speak was the Latino Student Association. I guess now the Latinx Student Association, right? Well, unfortunately, they couldn't find necessarily a representative from the group. So me being one of the few brown faces in the crowd was pulled to be the representative for the Latino Student Association at DU. And I have this very vivid memory of kind of right behind or right in front of where it's now Sturm Hall. It was called the General Classroom Building at the time, and the business school at the time, of sort of being the only face, right, of the Latino Student Association on campus. So busing certainly prepared me and sort of conditioned me to sort of be thinking about me occupying spaces in which the color line about who was white, who wasn't white, your identity, was constantly navigating that piece almost from my earliest childhood memories. But particularly busing and my experience at DU helped reinforce that. I'll finish here with another experience that happened while I was a student at DU, but it actually happened at Chatfield Reservoir. And I was actually out at Chatfield Reservoir with some of my friends from high school. We were all, it was kind of the summer between our freshman and sophomore years. And we were all just getting together. Many of these friends of mine were, in fact, all of them were white. And we were being a little loud and noisy beyond the quiet hours, and a park ranger came over and asked us to quiet down. And we thought we did, but the park ranger kind of came back and continued to persist and said that we were being loud, we were being rowdy, he was going to break things up. So one of the things that happened directly to me was as he was breaking things up, he came directly to me, and he actually threatened me and said, you all are going to be arrested unless you break things up. And after some back and forth, he actually struck me with his baton that he had. And then he asked me and a couple others to lie face down on the ground. And he called in for backup. And the backup was the police force at the time. So police officers arrived in the scene within 5 minutes. And as the officer is recounting what's happening, he points to me and says, that kid on the ground, that Asian kid on the ground, was trying to do some kung fu on me. So I had to put him down. And so I think at that moment, there's sort of two important realizations for me. One is the centrality of who's considered white and non-white, particularly in kind of this moment of policing, but also as well, the challenges, the miscommunications, the misperceptions about how that plays itself out, right? So I was a threat, not because I was identified personally myself as Latino or Latinx, but because I was Asian, right? And was going to potentially be a threat to this officer because of that. So that moment for me, I think, to really kind of build on what Neda was talking about, right, is the way that power really sort of gets to define externally and in violent sorts of ways what these racial categories, and in particular what this color line between white and non-white actually means.
Thank you for sharing. We didn't go deep into this with this question, but obviously there are negative impacts for people, costs associated with these systems of inequity, not just for people of color, but also for white people. Those are different and not the same, but again, we are all bound up in these systems and are seeing lots of that in the news and hopefully through conversations and explorations each of us is doing. Bearing that in mind, and therefore that these need to change. I'm curious for the panelists, what are some of the things you have seen that have worked for you in supporting others in working toward racial justice? What has not worked, either you've done or others have done? And then what do you need or not need from those wishing to help on these? So kind of a big question, kind of thinking about that action. We're definitely leaping over quite a bit of problem analysis and what the human costs of these are. But in the interest of time, again, and the promise for today's session, what are those, the good and best and not best practices you've seen or done or witnessed in working for racial justice? And I will give you a moment to think on that since that was a giant question. Two things I had noted in thinking about this. One, and this may speak to one of the questions we had come in from an audience member. I identify as a gay man, and part of my journey in the race work was presuming that because I had a marginalized identity, I got it. And I knew what it was like to be the one down, and evoked that equivalency far too often with friends of color and people of color I was working with and trying to make connection. And my experience has been that that was a forced thing I was trying to do, and wasn't really acknowledging that while their dynamics are similar, and they are definitely can be different. And a DU alum named Francie Kendall, who's actually written quite a bit on whiteness, and I were at a conference together, the National Conference on Race and Ethnicity, and there was an effort for out-identifying and allied folks around sexual orientation and gender identity issues to wear rainbow stickers on their name tags to kind of own some space and be present, be seen, send a positive message. And Francie refused to put it on. And I asked her, Francie, why aren't you doing that? And she said, this is a space focused on race and ethnicity. I don't need to, as a white person, run to this marginalized identity. I need to sit in the race privilege and what that means. This is not the time, this is not the place. I have lots of other places I can do that. Are there intersections? Yes. Is this an important issue to talk about? But here, with this explicit focus, I don't need to try to even appear to slip out of that. And so that was a good reminder for me. And I know I continue to step in it on a regular basis, even as a professional in this work. And so while I cannot demand it of them, I am always grateful for the grace and mercy and patience of people of color when I slip back into it or step in it deeply. So those are two things, just being mindful that my other identities don't cancel out or equate to my race. And again, just that when it's offered, not when I demand it, some grace and mercy from people of color. Other folks, things that have worked or not worked for you.
I have some thoughts I could share. So I think a few things. I think the biggest question that I keep hearing is, what is your intention? And I think that is something everyone needs to ask. It's like, what is your intention of making that post, of showing up to this protest, of, going to affinity group meetings or like whatever else that is, excuse me. Because I think that unless you can be clear with yourself, if that's out of wanting to make yourself feel better, or if that's actually wanting to support people, I think that the way that you will do that should look very, very different. And at the core of that, I think it's really important for all folks, especially non-Black folks at this time in life, to ask yourselves, how is it that you want to show up and what is it that you need to work through? And I think that is a hard question depending on how you're asking that to yourself. But I think when I go back to the idea of support, help, and need, I think all three of those look very, very different, and remembering that there are some things that are kind of collective across the board, but also don't forget that the people that you might be wanting to support, help, or address their needs are actually people. So if that's someone in your life, I think that that relationship is going to look a lot different than if it's a public group of people that you're trying to support. So just hands down. I think quickly kind of addressing some of the costs that I've seen in my life and what would have been great and what would not have been great. I can give some examples, but as far as costs, based on racial injustice that I've experienced that with my relationships, I've experienced that with my career, and I've definitely experienced that within my communities. All three of those realms. And like I said, I'm saying this as an Arab woman from North Africa. So I know that there are some pieces there, but I am not white. I'm not black, right? I am not white and I am not black. I'm not either of those two, meaning I don't know white people what you need to be doing. I can give you some thoughts, and I want to help you and support you depending on if we have a relationship, right? Like I really, really do. And I want to name that. And for the Black folk, like I don't know that full experience, and I will never say that I fully understand that. Period. I think that to get very specific in the relationships that I've lost, and this has been actually from supervisors. So a lot of times I think that the heaviest weight of racial injustice I've experienced have been from institutions, have been from workplaces, have been from power dynamics based on me as an employee and a supervisor. And that has been at DU, that has been in college access with other brown people. And that has also been at the expense of like, I guess you can say economic privilege with a foundation as well. So I've seen that across all of those realms. And so I'm just going to say, like, even our brown folk, like very different level, very, 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 very different level. And I want that to be recorded and starred and like noted 1,000 times over. But I want to be very clear that just because you might be brown, just because you might have some experiences of XYZ, does not mean that you understand what it means to be Black or Indigenous in this country. And in this specific moment, Black. And so I've seen Black notions throughout my communities. And that is something that I need to fight and need to address. And I know that. So I'm speaking on behalf and to our other brown folks who are not Black, because I know that other folks here can speak on the whiteness experience. But I think to get very, very clear when it comes to helping, don't center yourself. Just don't. Like if you're going to ask a question, I think that at the core of it, it's, are you helping someone else? To what extent? To actually provide resources, maybe you have some resources that you're wanting to contribute to, whether that be a protest or whether that be to a personal friend of yours, or whether that be to, help others be educated if you have that financial means to buy books, to buy access to subscriptions, to buy access to whatever, right? It's asking yourself, what is it that you can do and why is it that you want to help? I do think that everybody should be considering these things and like working and helping in some capacity. But I think at the core of it, what I might say from what I've experienced and from what I've heard is that what people do not need is you filling up their inbox to educate yourself, right? Like there are people who've been paid and who get some money to do this work and who have published books, who are doing podcasts and all of that. Go buy their books, go listen to their stories, right? Don't ask your brown and Black friend to make you feel better unless they explicitly say, I'm here to support you as a white person navigating this. But don't fill up the inboxes of your friends trying to make yourself feel better or trying to do anything else other than send love. So I have a lot of other thoughts, but I'll turn over the floor to others and then I'll jump in if it makes sense later.
I'll go ahead. There's some great ideas. One of the things, sort of building upon what I had mentioned earlier about my experience at DU is DU actually, through some great mentors I had as an undergraduate, John Livingston in particular, in the history department, introduced me to what was then the very earliest sort of nascent ideas regarding critical race theory. And so this is back in the mid 90s, right? The early 1990s. And one of the things I would say that is that as I've come to know critical race theory, as I've come to be a practitioner of the principles of critical race theory, is that sort of behind a lot of our actions is having a theory of power and having a real sort of open and clear-eyed understanding about how power works, right? In order to achieve the goals, right? The sort of end games that we're looking at. I sort of, I'll give an example based upon my own scholarship that again originated at DU. I was encouraged and was able to write an honors thesis on the Crusade for Justice, which was one of the more influential and important Chicano civil rights organizations, Chicano movement organizations based here in Denver in the 1960s. And I've actually, I think I want to write about this at some point, but I've speculated and sort of try to think about what would have happened in context of Denver if the Chicano movement and the Crusade for Justice in particular, instead of focusing their efforts, for instance, upon an issue such as police brutality, right, which was huge then, continues to be huge now, right? What if the Chicano movement had actually had an effort to take over the Denver Water Board? Part of my experience, part of my trajectory is also connected to law. And I've been privileged to work with a lot of water lawyers, both here in Colorado and in the larger American West. And those of us that deal in the work of water know that the most powerful lawyers in the West, in Colorado, even in the world, are the water lawyers, right? And those who have access to things like water. So the long and the short of that story is that's where the resources are. That's where the power lies, right? That's where we get to sort of think about not just things like sort of policing, but things like property development, things like job creation, things like where schools are sited, right? Things about sort of equitable distribution of resources. So I think having a theory of power is really important. And that sort of helps connect the dots, right, between all the ways that we're experiencing this moment. Because just as we've seen and talked about, right, what's happened in Minneapolis is also tied to segregation, right? It's tied to the way that the property development has happened. It's tied to the way that economic opportunities have been extended or not to certain sorts of communities. And I think undergirding all of that is a real commitment for all of us. And this has been something that I've had great mentorship. I've had very courageous colleagues to have a set of principles that guide all of our work. I will call attention to a certain set of principles that I've helped sign on to and draft and sign on to that my colleagues and I over at the College of Law in the Rocky Mountain Collective on Race, Place, and Law drafted. We have a set of principles that are tied to questioning things like meritocracy, right? Talking about the importance of history, understanding the centrality of anti-subordination, anti-essentialism, right? These are principles that should guide everything that we do, right? Both as professionals and I would also say in our private lives. And I think the final point I'd make about that is having these set of principles and having this theory of power also makes us very vulnerable, right? It means that you will have to make choices about whether you're going to engage in policies and practices that create greater inequities, right? Exacerbate greater inequities, are silent or tacit about policies and practices that lead to or continue to perpetuate the moments that we're in. As we know, these are not new moments. These are moments that are centuries long in the making, right? And will continue to be. So having the set of principles, having that theory of power, I think can really link us in terms of our work and can drive the work moving forward.
Thanks, Tom. And as Art or Kristin get ready to jump in, I was just going to say we've had a question about whether we will be sharing the questions and the resources that we are mentioning, and we are definitely taking notes of those, and we'll make sure we get those out. I'll have some websites at the end to share. So if folks are wondering that about will they have access to questions and resources, yes, we will definitely do that. Art, looks like you're ready.
Yeah, so I'd like to just talk a little bit about the sort of interpersonal level and where that takes us, where it takes me. One of the things that I had to struggle with growing up was learning from my parents, who were really my best teachers at the time. Both my parents had migrated from Norfolk, Virginia to New York during what was called the Great Migration. early 1930s. And neither one of them had graduated from high school. They didn't have any kind of education, but they were very self-confident. And they knew all about racism, taught all of us about racism, but they had this idea that, and I sort of alluded to this in my first answer, that if you really worked twice as hard as everyone else and whatever, that you could get ahead. They knew that they couldn't do it, but for all of their children, they wished for us that we could do it. And as I mentioned before, I had to really revisit that whole theory when, you know, I ended up as a young man in the military during the Vietnam War. And I had to then sort of try to figure out kind of how do I navigate personal relationships, because initially it was really confusing to me. And what I found later as a real resource, really, and some of us here at DU can relate to this, was an early article that was written by our friend Bill Cross on the stages of a Black identity. And I had an opportunity to meet him right after he wrote that article. And that's sort of, I started to try to understand that people are at different levels of awareness of their consciousness and of themselves. And this happens for both Black people. It actually happens for everyone in terms of their racial identity development. And so a guiding kind of principle for me in terms of who's going to be helpful or not helpful is to really kind of make an assessment as I get to know people of kind of where they stand. And it tells me a little bit about what I can do, what I can share or not share, how helpful I can be or not helpful I can be. I've also learned a lot about the power of empathy and close relationship, and have discovered that I have this unique ability to talk to people who may not initially have an awareness of what's going on a racial level, and I have this ability to really make a change. And it's worked really well for me as a teacher. And that's been good in that realm. I think the cost has been the constant vigilance. It's really, really difficult. Just kind of trying to figure where people are and where someone might show up in one way and then surprise me because I've made a wrong assessment, and kind of constantly be ready to deal with something that's coming out of left field. That's been kind of it's been a sort of, I think, the biggest sources of stress. It played out for me in one really important relationship that I had several years ago with a colleague and friend who was very progressive, a white friend who was very progressive politically, and I felt really comfortable. But then we had children who were the same age, and when our children were ready to go to high school, my son was going to go to East High School here in Denver, and she was telling me that no way would her son go to East High School because they had all those bad kids there and all this other stuff. And it just threw me. It totally changed sort of how I had to figure out how I would relate to her at that point, because I had kind of misread where she was. So it's that sort of levels of personal development. It has worked for me in professional relationships and so forth, but sometimes I get it wrong. And when I get it wrong, there's a big cost that comes with it. The flip side of this, and I have to say, Tom and I were talking about this morning, is in my many years as a teacher, one of the biggest joys for me was taking people who were at a lower level of kind of awareness and development, and really through just being real and just being person to person, able to really get them to the place where I could see them opening their eyes and seeing things in a different way. And that's a very exciting place to be. It's been very rewarding to see that. I do want to mention that another resource for me that has been incredibly important, especially over the last 20, 25 years, has been my immersion in the narratives and songs of enslaved people. And what that's taught me is of a people who lived under possibly the worst conditions of racial oppression that you could imagine, that they could figure out that if you had an internal centering point and an ability to really connect to who you are, that was supported by a community of people that you could trust, that you could navigate all these things effectively. And even when you were being humiliated and mistreated, you could figure out a way to continue walking and continue to doing the things that you want to do. And that teaching from these ancestors has probably been by far the biggest sort of contribution to my ability to stay sane in this crazy world, where the racism that has persisted for years and years and has never really been faced in any real way by the culture at large. That's been really incredibly helpful. And it's been helpful in terms of allowing me to stay positive as I do my work.
I'll step in real quick, and then because I know that there's some questions or whatnot. So oddly enough, I think about these things in a variety of ways, and actually most of my colleagues and friends here have hit on them. So structural, ideological, interpersonal, but the one that I'll maybe throw out there, especially as a white woman, is intrapersonal, right? And so one of the things that I think is not helpful, or at least for me has been helpful, kind of, I'll go back and forth in that conversation, is our either putting forward or in front of everything else our own emotions as white people. So that could be fear, that could be tears, right? There's a lot of conversation about Karens and white women tears or white women's anger, and how those things are harnessed to not just produce, but reproduce and reinscribe understandings of racial superiority via or vis-a-vis emotion. But the hard thing, and I think the other kind of, if you're someone who can see that, you see what's happening, right? So we saw what was happening with Amy Cooper a couple weeks ago, or maybe 10 days ago now. Often the flip happens then. So it's, I'm gonna just kind of cut off engagement because I don't know how to emotionally engage. And those emotions are such a huge part of who we are. So there's, I don't know who said this, but I often quote it, that we like to think of ourselves as rational beings who emote sometimes, when in reality we're emotional beings who are rational sometimes. And I think then what happens is we go from one set of emotions to maybe the same emotion, but it's deployed differently. And the one that I hear a lot lately, and I'll put myself that I've been in this boat, is fear. Fear of saying the wrong thing, fear of not saying enough, fear of saying nothing, fear of on and on and on and on and on. And what that often does is it results in silence. We don't do anything. And we hope either that in our silence, we can kind of fade into the background. And often then what I hear is, well, I'm just giving space for people of color, or I'm just giving space for Black people, which in itself is a really problematic comment, whether you think about it or not, because it says that you are presuming the right to give space, which puts you again in the place of power. We have power in our silence, oddly enough. And so one of the things I think about in terms of what doesn't help is the overthinking and rethinking and overthinking of that emotional space to the point where we are silent. What that does mean is, and Thomas said this, and you got to be ready to stick your foot in your mouth. You've got to be okay with it, learning how to apologize. You got to be okay with asking tough questions, but more so asking the really tough questions of yourself first, right? So Neda talked about it, kind of educate yourself. There is a ton of work out there to read, podcasts, everything is so readily available. I wish some of the stuff was available when I was younger, but you've got to engage that emotional space and be willing to interrogate those emotions in a way that is super uncomfortable, but will be productive in the end. I think it will be, right? And if it is that you need to ask those hard questions, but you need a sounding board, then find other white folk who are doing the work. Whether you think they're ahead of you or behind you, that doesn't matter, but ask the hard questions of each other as well. Because if fear places us in either a place of silence or reactivity, we're not doing anything to help the situation. And so for me, it's been having a good group of friends and colleagues that I can pose questions to, who will, if I pose a question, will often just ask a question in return to make sure that I'm thinking through it on my own, and not give me a solid answer, which I tend to do to other people as well. But be willing to engage that emotional space, even in how sticky and hard and messy it is, and then figure out how to apologize. And not a politician's apology, not that I'm sorry I made you feel this, but the like, wow, I effed up and that's on me. And I have to figure out how to do that differently. So that's just my thoughts there.
Thanks, everybody. As you can see, we literally have 4 minutes left. We got through 2 of the 5 questions we had planned to talk about, and have maybe touched on one of the questions out of the chat. And so I just want to say really quickly, and then maybe have one closing thought from the panelists. If you had one sentence, a challenge or support to put out to the folks joining us about what they can do from here, particularly as the school year comes to a close, what would that be? So think on that, and let me say, as more questions keep coming back in, that we will be gathering the questions from the chat, and putting out some resources. Specifically, a few I want to mention before folks have to jump to 1 o'clock things, or noon events rather. One is that this is only the first of the next in the series that Community Plus Values is doing. There will be another conversation next Thursday at 11, also on race. I don't have the title handy, but this is not the end. I hope the panelists might agree with me that this is not a conversation you wrap up and solve and finish in an hour, much less with, we had about 225 people participating. It's just not going to be enough. We have to keep working on this. So again, future Community Plus Voices conversations, look for those. Office of Teaching and Learning with C+V and some other partners, including us, is launching today a relaunch of the Inclusive Teaching Practices website. That will be mentioned in the bridge and at otl.du.edu. And I would say we're all educators, even if we aren't teaching in classes, so that's not something just for folks in the faculty or instructor role. The Office of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, ODEI, is actually building out a website with resources around current events. And there are a number of resources that you can find if you Google responsibly. There is no lack of good information out there. I will put some other things up there, including some that were mentioned here, and campus and community resources as well. Again, number of great questions in the chat. Some of them were very specific, but very deep. Others were asking some why questions that might not be what we as panelists can speak to, trying to focus on the personal experience, but we'll gather all that and get some more information out. So in our last 2 minutes, literally very briefly, panelists, any last challenges to those to continue the good work?
I'll jump in really fast, Thomas. So I would say just be open to learning, no matter who you are, what location you're in. And it's not just books, articles, whatever, but it's encounters that you have that might open your eye to something new. A conversation that you had and you thought, wow, I didn't really understand that. So just be open. That makes you vulnerable, but we all need to be vulnerable at this time.
I'll jump in. Very quickly, surround yourself with all those who allow you to be courageous.
I would say remember to act out of love for the Black community and not out of grief, not out of hate, not out of shame, not out of anything that you might be processing, but out of love for the Black community.
I'd say be willing to interrogate those first emotions, right? So if it's fear, if it's even a response of like, what's the deal with rioting? Like, that's a hard statement. So stop and say, where is that thought coming from? where did I learn certain scripts about this? Why am I using these words, right? So be willing to do the hard interrogation and ask yourself the questions of why and where and how.
And for me, I know I have to remind myself that my choice not to engage with these issues or to think about these difficult things or to risk that fear Kristin was talking about is an exercise of my privilege, that folks of color, particularly Black folks, don't get to opt out of the experiences around race and racism. And so I could probably do more and lean in a little bit more than I regularly do. And that's a challenge for myself and folks like me. Again, we will post some resources. Watch for that through Bridge and websites and other places. Thanks to our panelists, to C+V for hosting us, our tech staff, and Captioner for joining us. And I think we're done.